Welcome to this next study, which is going to be on Millennial Views, and I used for this study the Rose Guide to End Time Prophecy by authors Timothy Paul Jones, David Gunderson, and Benjamin Gallen. I really love this book because it goes into detail about the three views that I'm going to share, but they do not reveal their own opinion on that. So they just give a very well-rounded view of all three of them. And it was just a lot of great knowledge. Now I'm going to share my goal. Their goal was to give you knowledge. My goal is to give you some guidance as well. So you will hear my opinion on this topic. If you've seen me in any other videos, you know that I am opinionated. So I am going to share that, and you could take it or leave it, but I am going to share that opinion. So let me share my screen so that we can get into the PowerPoint. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the three millennial views pertaining to the millennial reign of Christ. And if you do not know what millennial means, you look at that root there. Melli is 1,000. So it means the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now that is something that all three views agree on, that there is a 1,000-year reign of Christ. And we're going to get into the details of what each of these views are. The first one is pre-millennial. The millennium is a future event, and Jesus will return before, with the prefix pre, the millennium. So before the millennium happens, Jesus will have his second coming. The next one is post-millennial. Those who believe this believe that Jesus will return after, hence the word prefix post, the millennium. The millennium is a time in which most of the world submits to Jesus and peace and justice reign. And then our final one is amillennial. That view is that the millennium is a symbol of Christ's present reign among his people. And this is just a handy chart so that you can actually see what it looks like. I always like to have a timeline so you can picture this visually. So we see with the premillennium, this is the cross. Christ reigns on earth literally for 1,000 years, but during this time, this is not the millennial reign. So you see the second coming happens, and then he's reigning literally for 1,000 years physically on the earth, and then the last judgment happens. With the post-millennial view, this there's a millennium that is ushered in by the church. We'll get into that in detail more later. So there's a millennium that happens, and then after that, the second coming and last judgment happen at the same time at the end of that millennium that is brought about by the church. And then amillennial view is the belief that this whole period of time from the cross until the second coming is that millennium. So it's a symbolic 1,000 years because we of course know that it's already been 2,000 years since Christ. So it doesn't mean, according to them, an actual 1,000 years. It's just symbolic of that time. And they, like the post-millennials, believe that the second coming and the last judgment happens at the same time. If you look up here at the premillennial, second coming happens, then the 1,000 years, and then the last judgment. So you can see the similarities and differences pretty well in this slide. All right, so just to caution all of us when we get into this, all of those who hold these views are still considered within Orthodox Christianity. So we can have our disagreements and among other believers and not become so arrogant that we are like, wow, you're not a Christian if you do not believe what I believe. So all of them, we know that they agree on these three foundational truths: that Jesus is in fact returning, like he said he would. Number two, that Jesus will judge all of humanity. All three of these believe that. And that number three, God will resurrect all humanity, some to eternal life and others to eternal death. So these are things that we do agree on. All of them believe that Jesus will have a second coming eventually, a physical second coming, but where and when that happens is just different. All right, so we're going to first talk about amillennialism. They believe that the Great Tribulation is not an event that will happen in the future. They believe it happens throughout human history whenever persecutions happen to God's people. They think it's going on right now, and it has been going on since the cross. They believe that 1,000 years, as I said earlier, is not to be taken literally. It is symbolic of the greatness of the Messiah's present reign rather than a specific time period. Also, amillennialists believe that Satan's power is restrained right now because he was defeated by Christ's victory on the cross and in the empty tomb. So they really emphasize that Satan is being restrained and that Christ has that victory already. Satan will be allowed to deceive the nations again at the end of time. Then Jesus will reveal himself and destroy every resistance to his reign. He will judge all and send those who haven't confessed Jesus as Lord to eternal torment. Now, that last sentence is what all three of them believe. But when you get to amillennialism, they believe that this last deception will happen at the end of this millennial reign, which is currently going on. And then Jesus will come physically. But as soon as he comes physically, the judgment will happen. There will not be a physical period of him reigning on earth at that point. All right, so they do not see the events of Revelation as chronological, meaning one right after the other. Instead, they believe they are happening simultaneously throughout human history. So if you've done any presentations with us, seen the trumpets, the bowls, the seals, they think that all that stuff is happening and symbolically happening throughout all of history. And so this is sort of a breakdown, this visual of, this is the cross, Old Testament times back there. They believe that the kingdom of God is now, that there's a spiritual millennial reign, that church is actually also on earth in tribulation, and that Israel has been replaced by the church, that we no longer refer to them as like a separate group. And they believe that, remember I was telling you about Satan's final rebellion, like they believe he's being restrained during all this period right now, that he's currently restrained, but then he'll be let out at the end, then the second coming will happen, and then the resurrection, and then we go into the eternal state. So this is their timeline. Now, who had these beliefs? Who are some famous people that we know about that have these beliefs? First of all, Augustine of Hippo, many of you know of him. So he definitely believed this. He actually popularized it, and we're going to get into this with postmillennial as well. Origen held this belief earlier, but by the time it came around to Augustine, the church had come to accept this idea and embraced it more readily with Augustine of Hippo. So this is a picture of Augustine. Martin Luther and most of the reformers had held to amillennialism. So they came out of the church and the Catholic Church and had much different ideas about a lot of issues, but they kept with the same view that the Catholic Church held on the end times, which is amillennialism. And then we see John Calvin. This is a picture of John Calvin, also a reformer. And we also, and going forward to current times, we have J.I. Packer, which some of you may be familiar with. He's a teacher who held to this view. And then we have Hank Hanegraaff. Now, I am familiar with Hank Hanegraaff, even you may not have heard of him. He was known as the Bible Answer Man. I listened to him a lot when I was in high school. And one of the great things that my mother gave to me as like a legacy was that we listened to the Bible Answer Man together. I think it came on the radio every day. I think there was a daily program, and a lot of times people would call and ask questions of him, and he would give answers. He was very into apologetics, but sometimes they would ask about end times, not always, but of course he had that millennialist view, and my mom did not hold that view. So of course she and I would talk and discuss that with him. But I knew from that time, and we really respected his views, but we didn't agree with him on millennialism. But I just wanted to point that out. So even though I think we very much respect all of the people on this screen, and yet they hold to this amillennialist view, which might be different than what we are used to. The scriptural support. So with all these views, I'd like to go into what scriptures they use. So to support that the victory has already been secured and that Satan is actually already bound, they see the binding of Satan as a metaphor for shattering Satan's power by Jesus's victory on the cross. So you're not going to picture Satan as being like physically bound somewhere in hell or something like that. They're not picturing him actually being like in any kind of physical way restrained and unable to still be on earth. So they would, because you and I know we can be tempted by Satan, we would say, well, how is he bound if we're being able to? Well, they don't question it. They don't deny that. they say that his just power is more limited than it was, and it's symbolic and a metaphor for that power being shattered on the cross. And so, with each one of these, I want to cover at least one. I urge you to read all of the scriptures that you see here on your own time, but right now we have time just to read a few. So let's go ahead and open up to Luke 10:18-19 and read that passage together so that we can see what it's saying about Satan being bound. Okay, in Luke 10:18-19, it says, "He said to them, I watched Satan fall from heaven like lightning. Look, I have given you the authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy. Nothing at all will harm you. However, don't rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven." So this is Jesus talking to his disciples and saying, I watched Satan fall. He's already lost his power, and he's given them this authority to have this power over Satan. So that's one of the verses that they use. Our next point is, like I said earlier, they do believe that the devil can still tempt us, but his power is constrained because Jesus has already defeated him. So let's go to 1 Peter 5:8. First Peter 5:8 says, "Be sober-minded, be alert. Your adversary, the devil, is prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for anyone he can devour." Now, of course, when I first read this feels like it's not in favor of this position, to be quite honest, because this is saying he's still on the loose. He's roaming around ready to devour anybody. But to be fair to this position, I interpret it the way it's saying, well, his power is not limited right now. And we do know that our salvation is secure and Jesus has already defeated him on the cross, but he's still being given a lot of leeway on the earth, in my opinion. But the way that a millennialist would interpret this passage is that despite what it says right here and him prowling around and looking for people to devour, he is still not, he's just symbolically restrained. So they will use that verse for it. Further on scriptural support, they cite Matthew 13:24-30 and 36-43. So let's go on over to Matthew and read what that has to say. And this is to prove the point that the good and bad will grow together until the end. And I'll describe what they're meaning by that after we read the passage. So Matthew 13:24-30. He presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while people were sleeping, his enemy came, sowed weeds among the wheat, and left. When the plant sprouted and produced again, then the weeds also appeared. The landowner's servants came to him and said, "Master, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Then where did those weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he told them. "So do you want us to go out and pull them all up?" The servants asked him. "No," he said. "When you pull up the weeds, you might also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At harvest time, I'll tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and tie them in bundles to burn them, but collect the wheat in my barn." And then we skip that to go to verse 36-34, 43, where he's describing what this parable means. It says that then he left the crowds and went into the house. His disciples approached him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." He replied, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed, these are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. Therefore, just as the weeds are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather from his kingdom all who cause sin and those guilty of lawlessness. They will throw them into the blazing furnace where will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom. Let anyone who has ears, listen. So this is kind of complicated. So what they're saying here is that, back when I showed you that they believe that while we're having the millennial reign, a time of goodness and peace, there also is tribulation going on for believers as well during this whole period of the millennial reign. So they're saying that the good and the bad grow together, and that that's their proof for the simultaneous aspects of both good happening and bad happening. Now, what I would caution you to look at is look carefully at this interpretation and see who it's talking about here. Who is identified as the seed? Is it this time period or these events? To me, it would need to say that this is talking about events being the subject of this good seed. It's talking about people. So it says the good seed were the children of God, of the kingdom, and the bad seed are the children of the evil one. So I see that and definitely interpret that as saying that within the church during this time, which I don't consider the millennial reign, there's just going to be good and bad seed, meaning there's going to be people who are in the church professing to be Christians, and either they don't know that they aren't, or they're purposely deceiving people just to infiltrate the church. And so they grow together until the end. So that doesn't contradict at all, other views. So I don't really interpret it here the way that they do, that the good and bad things are happening at the same time. All right, this next one is the Bible frequently uses the number 1,000 figuratively. So there's lots of Psalms here, and 2 Peter you can go to, but we're going to go to Psalm 90, verse 4. It says, "For in your sight 1,000 years are like yesterday that passes by, like a few hours of the night." So this is showing you that God uses that number 1,000 to often be like a figurative time. It doesn't always mean it's literal. And if you follow the trail with all these other verses, you will see that too, that it might not even be referring to a time period. It's just referring to, I think 50 talks about sheep possibly. So it doesn't, or hills, on 1,000 hills. So it's not necessarily meaning there were literally 1,000 hills that this person had in view. So I will grant that to them. I will say that, it is true that the Bible will often use a number in a figurative manner. So we can't be dogmatic in saying that it must be a literal 1,000 years. So, I do believe it is, but I will accept that it's a possibility. All right, we're going to move on to postmillennialism and get to our first point. They believe that worldwide acceptance of the gospel will usher in the millennial kingdom. They emphasize the power of the gospel to transform societies and individual lives, which I really do love that emphasis that they give, and you're going to see how it impacts their beliefs in a positive way regarding missionaries. So they really, really strongly emphasize the transformational power of the gospel, which is good. Jesus, they believe, will not be physically present during the millennium. They will believe that he will reign spiritually through the power and proclamation of the gospel. So they only believe that he's here in the sense that the gospel is being proclaimed, and it's just a spiritual reign. So most people, they believe, will trust in Jesus during this time period, and that the Jews will recognize him as their Messiah. They also believe that war will give way to peace as entire countries and civilizations turn to Jesus. They believe that Revelation 20, verse 5 is spiritual regeneration rather than a physical resurrection from the dead. Now, we're going to read Revelation 20 in its entirety when we talk about premillennial views. But let's just read verse 5 to see what they're talking about right here. It says in verse 5, "The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection." So, when we take that literally, we believe that the first resurrection is talking about, it really means there were 1,000, there was, the dead who did raise to life at this time period. They don't believe that. They believe this is not referring to a physical raising, but more a spiritual regeneration. All right. Oh, didn't say the last point. They believe that God will allow Satan to deceive the nations toward the end. Then Jesus will return to earth physically to defeat Satan. So very similar to all millennialists in that. Okay, who holds to this view? Well, I was talking earlier about Origen of Alexandria, and he was one of the first to come up with the belief that led to both postmillennialism and amillennialism. And we're going to get into, when I talk about the differences of why it's confusing whether or not they're both Augustine and Origen are postmillennial or amillennial. We'll get into that. But Origen would be one of the first early church fathers to discuss this extensively. He lived in 184 to 253 AD. And then Augustine of Hippo lived from 354 to 430. So that's the one that comes after that. But only in some of their beliefs do they follow postmillennialism. Some are on track with that and some not. Remember, at this point in time, neither Origen or Augustine would call themselves all or postmillennial because those terms did not exist. We've kind of imposed those terms later to describe what we see in their writings. All right, so let me get into next, Jehoiakim Fiore. So this right here is Origen. We already saw Augustine before, and this is the Jehoiakim character. Let me turn to that in this book and just kind of describe who he was. He was a 12th century monk named Jehoiakim of Fiore, and he expected what he called an age of the Holy Spirit, a worldwide millennial kingdom wherein Jesus would reign spiritually through the church to begin around, he was very specific, around 1260 AD. So postmillennialism, of course, was not a new idea. He came up with this in the 12th century. And then later up, so like there weren't that many people who held on to this. Most people were amillennialists during the time. But picking up on what Jehoiakim started in the 1700s, Daniel Whitby, which is this person right here, Daniel Whitby popularized what Jehoiakim had said and made it more relatable to in modern times. So this is what he said. He became convinced of these 4 points. He said a time would come when the entire world would turn to Jesus. He believed the Jews would return to the Holy Land and Muslim nations would be defeated. That all of this would mark the beginning of 1,000 years of peace, righteousness, and happiness. And that Jesus would not, however, return physically until this time came to a close. So all of this time of peace that's happening, Jesus isn't physically here on earth. He's just reigning through his church. Okay, so also the next person that we're going to discuss is Jonathan Edwards over here in this corner. He caught on to Whitby's ideas, and in the 1730s and early 1800s, there were a lot of revivals that happened in the American colonies that came later to be known as the Great Awakening. And very much influential in that is a person you've probably heard of, which is Jonathan Edwards. He became thoroughly convinced by what Whitby shared. And so he was very much in believing in postmillennialism. So let me just read to you a quote about what he believed. He says that God seems now to be hastily gathering in his elect from all parts of the land. So he believes that, all that was happening with the Great Awakening was what God was doing. And he said that he eagerly anticipated the future promised advancement of the kingdom of Christ during the millennium as an event unspeakably happy and glorious. It is represented as a time of vast increase of knowledge and understanding, a time wherein religion and true Christianity shall in every respect be uppermost, a time wherein vital piety shall take possession of thrones and palaces, and those that are in most exalted stations shall be eminent in holiness, a time of wonderful union, where the nations shall beat their swords into plowshares, and God will cause wars to cease to the end of the earth, a time wherein all heresies and false doctrines shall be exploded, and the church of God shall not be rent with a variety of jarring opinions. Isn't that interesting? We're definitely having I think every denomination has had splits based on differences of opinions in this modern time. a time wherein the whole earth shall be united as one holy city, one heavenly family. So he was so optimistic because of the Great Awakening in the early Americas. And there seemed to be so much positive, and the America was founded on godly principles, and there was so much good that he saw, and he was so optimistic that now we read this and we're like, what? There's lots of wars. It's not getting better. It's not optimistic. There might be an increase of knowledge, but now there's more misinformation than knowledge around. And we definitely do not see people in authority who are even worthy. I mean, it's hard to even find anyone you want to vote for anymore because they're so lacking in character. But that was not the case when Edwards was around. So, you have to think about their time period very much affected what they believed. So Edwards believed the Great Awakening revivals were God's preparation of the church for the millennial kingdom. Sharing the gospel with every nation is essential to create conditions for millennial kingdom that brings about peace before Christ Jesus' return. And this inspired many missionaries to go overseas. So there was a good byproduct of post-millennialist beliefs. A lot of these missionaries wanted to go overseas to get this kingdom going, so that they believe that, if they pull this together, the church is actually able to usher in this peace. Then Jesus will eventually come after we've had 1,000 years of us doing this. William Carey, pictured here, he launched the Baptist Missionary Society and served in India, and he held to this belief, and really driven by wanting to create this kingdom. Postmillennialists do believe that the Great Tribulation comes before the millennial kingdom, but differ on when and how. Some are even preterists, and that means that they believe that most of those tribulation events actually happened in the first century at the time of the destruction of the temple. So, if you've been with us in the end time chronology study, you know that a lot of people differ on how and what he's talking about there, because some of what's in that passage did happen at that time. Of course, I just believe it's going to happen again at the end. But you see them, the preterists, thinking, oh, this part already happened, so we don't have that much of the tribulation left to fulfill. Let's go into the scriptural support for the postmillennialist view. So they believe that the church will have dominion over all nations of the earth. So let's go to Galatians 3:29. In each one of these, there's this Old Testament passage and then the New Testament fulfillment of the promise. But we're just going to have time right now to look at the New Testament. So take time on your own to look at those other passages. But let's go ahead and flip to Galatians 3:29. It says, "And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise." So they're saying that, the church, we are heirs of the promise seed that Abraham had, and we are the ones who are ruling the earth. All nations will learn justice and peace through the church. So let's go to Hebrews 12:22. Hebrews 12:22. "Instead, you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to myriads of angels, a festive gathering." Let's look at Isaiah 2, Isaiah 2:2-4. Okay, I think that's the one I really wanted to share. Isaiah 2:2-4. "In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills, and nations will stream to it. And many peoples will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways, so that we may walk in his paths.' For instruction will go out of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will settle disputes among the nations and provide arbitration for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives. Nations will not take up the sword against nation, and they will never again train for war." So they're seeing that, we as a church, they believe, ushers in this time period of peace where we basically teach the nations how to live rightly. I believe, though, that this passage refers to the millennial kingdom when Jesus is physically reigning on the earth, because if you've been with us through that end times chronology study, you realize nation will rise up against nation toward the end, and we will take up our weapons. It won't be peaceful. Even though some people will think it's going to be, it won't be peaceful at that time. So I do think that is something they were seeing as a possibility when this was popular, but I think now we kind of realize, I think that ship has sailed. The millennial kingdom will expand slowly and imperceptibly until it fills the whole world. Now this, when you go to Matthew 13, when you read this parable about the bread, you'll see what they're meaning by this. So 13:31 through 33. He presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all seeds, but when grown, it's taller than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the sky come and nest in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and mixed into 50 pounds of flour until all of it was leavened. So what they're saying is that while the gospel starts out slowly, which we know it did in a small area in the Middle East, it expanded slowly and imperceptibly until now it's taken over the whole world. And we do know the gospel has spread across the whole world, but we wouldn't take it so far to say that right now, if you were looking at our world, the influence of the gospel, even though it has spread to many nations and there are many believers, right now, I ask you, do you think the influence of the gospel has transformed people to being loving, peaceful people who want to obey God and his word and desire to live holy lives? I just don't see that. But I can see why they saw this, the time period in which many people held this belief. All right, continuing on, they believe that all ethnic Jews will believe Jesus is their Messiah before the end of time. Romans 11:26 through 27. It says, and in this way all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will turn godlessness away from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. And finally, they believe that before Jesus can claim his kingdom, those that are lost must come under the control of Jesus, and that is in Mark 3:27. Where it says, but no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his possessions unless he first ties up the strong man. Then he can plunder his house. So what they're saying is Jesus is going to allow the church, through the power of the gospel and transformation of it, to, bind Satan. And so he is not himself going to come until this person's already bound. So whereas, think about it this way, the amillennialists believe that Satan was bound at the cross. And during this whole time period since the cross, 2,000 years plus, he is bound and has a limited control. Postmillennials is a little bit different. They believe that because of the power of the gospel as it begins to take over the world, there will usher in this time of when believers and the church have more power over the world, and that will bind Satan, that strong man that's opposed. And then, of course, God will come. All right, so let's compare and contrast postmillennialism and amillennialism. You might have noticed that they are very, very similar, and you're probably wondering why. I don't really know the differences. Theologians, in fact, did not even distinguish between them before the 18th century. So that's why when I was talking earlier, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Augustine, and Origen identified as either one because of this. Like when you look in different texts, sometimes a source will say that they were postmillennialists and some will say amillennialists. And that's just because those beliefs had not diverged yet. They were basically so similar. We're not really sure what they held because there was no label at the time. So let's look at exactly how they're similar. They both see the millennial kingdom as spiritual rather than a physical reign. That's how they're different from premillennialism. They both agree on that. Next, they believe that Jesus returns at the end of the millennium rather than at the beginning. But let's look at how they're different. For all millennialists, the Great Tribulation and Millennial Kingdom occur at the same time. If you remember back to that timeline, they think it's been going on both since the cross. Postmillennialists believe the millennium takes place after the Great Tribulation. So they believe there's going to be a future time of tribulation, and then that 1,000-year reign will happen, but that Jesus is still not physically here yet. Amillennialists believe that Jesus is reigning spiritually with his saints in the heavens right now, while postmillennialists believe that Jesus will reign spiritually through the gospel on earth. I'll give you a chance to write that down. So hopefully you can see the slight differences that they have. All right, now let's get into premillennialism. Jesus will come back to earth physically after the Great Tribulation, according to premillennialists. And it is only after that time that the literal 1,000 years of peace will begin. So they don't believe it's spiritual. They think it's really going to really happen. All right. The 4 types of premillennial views are explored in other studies. So we've had other studies. You're welcome to look at them on YouTube or refer to them in our Bible study. They are going to talk about the timing of the second coming in relation to the Great Tribulation and Antichrist. So we're not going to get into that at all. We're going to just assume the premillennialist part. In those studies, we share which person, which, you know, how we just talked about Augustine and Origen and those kind of people. Well, I do share in detail with the premillennialists' views, all 4 of those views. I share who holds those views and which type of premillennial view on the rapture. So refer to that. So just know, like, just because I'm not covering it does not mean that people who are Orthodox and well respected in Christian circles do not hold to premillennialism. There's tons. So those are going to be in other views because we just don't have time in the study to go over that again. So let's jump to the scriptural support then and spend some time here because I'm going to have to read all of Revelation 20 for you to understand what this is about. Before I read it, I want you to know the other 2 views that seek to spiritualize Revelation 20 ignore the time references as well as those very specific descriptions of those who reign during the millennium, which you're going to see right now. They don't, you notice they didn't even use Revelation 20 all that much in their defense because it's kind of their worst enemy. If you're looking at amillennialists and postmillennialists, they really would rather not. They think that this is, they would love it if this chapter did not exist because it's troublesome for them. They do explain away and spiritualize it. Don't get from that I'm saying that they want to take it out of the scripture, but they do spiritualize it, but it is a troublesome passage for them. So let's go into the premillennialist position by reading this. Who think about it when I'm reading it, they literally, premillennialists, if you want to know their view, it's basically what Revelation 20 literally says. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key to the abyss and a great chain in his hand. So that's what's in the picture. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and closed it, and put a seal on it so that he would no longer deceive the nations until the 1,000 years were completed. After that, he must be released for a short time. So just look back at the word then. So the first thing in the first word was then. So really you need to go back and look at the previous chapter. What were we just talking about? This is where I was saying they're ignoring the time references. So in the previous chapter, you see really everything, the final things happening where Jesus has returned and the beast and his armies are defeated at Armageddon, and all of that stuff has happened. The second coming has just happened. So you see all of that being described in the fall of Babylon has happened, and heaven is celebrating as everything kind of comes to a close. The rider on the white horse is in chapter 19. That's Jesus coming back in his second coming. That's exactly what it's describing. And then we get to the word then in Revelation 20 and we realize, okay, then this millennial reign is going to happen. So that's when I was telling you that all millennials don't believe in the chronology of Revelation, that's why, because if they believed in the chronology, this would not make sense, because this chapter occurs, this description of this millennial reign, after the second coming has happened. So that's where premillennialists have come up with the view that the millennial reign is after Jesus' second coming, because in scripture, that's where it occurs. Okay, so going along, it says, then I saw thrones and people seated on them. This is verse 4, who were given authority to judge. I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus, and because of the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and who had not accepted the mark of their foreheads, on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. So let me pause right there and go back over this. So this is the who. I'm saying this is so specific. So if you look at all millennialists, they're saying that the who is all of the church through all of time since the cross. It's been 2,000 years. They think the who, those who are reigning in the millennium, are all believers in the church since that time. And then postmillennialists will believe that the who is all believers that usher it in, and then we have this 1,000-year reign without Christ present. That would be the who. But this is very specific about the who. It's saying it's only those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus, because of the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image and taken the mark on their forehead or hands. So that is actually not believers that all through time. So I, for example, think this would not include my grandfather, because he has already passed away and he did not ever get tempted by the mark or the image, because that didn't happen during his lifetime. So this could not be referring to him. So he is not one of those souls that will be reigning with Jesus during the millennium. And let me continue on for you to see that. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. They meaning these beheaded believers, these martyrs. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. So that's what that's saying, is that the rest, all other Christians who have died throughout time, if they were not martyred specifically at the time of the Antichrist, then they do not come to life during this millennial reign. It's only those believers who do. I mean, that's what it explicitly says in the text. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. When the 1,000 years are completed, so we're going on to the next thing chronologically, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, which means, he just goes everywhere across the earth. Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. They come up across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the encampment of the saints, the beloved city. Then fire came down from heaven and consumed them. The devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So we've got the event, first, the angel binds Satan, and then the martyred believers that did not take the mark reign with Jesus, and the rest of the dead do not come up first during that first resurrection. Then we have this Satan is allowed out after that 1,000 years reigns. He gathers a bunch of people together and tries to have a last rebellion. He's immediately consumed by fire, and then he is thrown into the lake of fire and punished. And then we find what happens next for humans is, then I saw a great white throne and one seated on it. Earth and heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. I also saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works by what was written in the books. Then the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and the death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. Each one was adjudged according to their works. Death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And anyone whose name was not found in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. So this is saying that after all of that stuff is completed, then we have the judgment. So if you can see where premillennialists get their idea, they see the second coming happening in chapter 19, specifically that white horse, the rider on the white horse, which is 19 verses 11 through 16. And then they see that chapter 20 is describing the binding of Satan, then the reigning of those martyrs with Christ for 1,000 years, and then everybody being resurrected again. Satan comes over last rebellion, then everybody's resurrected again in order to be judged, and then at that point, people are thrown into the lake of fire who do not have, who are not in the book of life, and the rest. We'll get into what happens to them. Next, the believers. Okay, the scriptural support. The other two views don't take Revelation 21 through 6 literally, but they do believe Revelation 27 through 15 are literal. So 7 through 15 was when the satanic about rebellion. They do believe that Satan will literally come and physically rebel with people at the end. So they take that literally. They take the great judgment literally. They think that people are literally going to rise from the dead, and that the judgment will happen and people will literally go to hell. So they don't have a different belief with us on hell, in the lake of fire. But what I find interesting is, why don't you want to take 21 through 6 literally? You can't just pick and choose. So this is inconsistent and a little too convenient to just suddenly mid-chapter decide it's not symbolic anymore. And also, let me go for scriptural support to Isaiah 11, 6 through 10. That is a great passage for the premillennial view. Isaiah 11, 6 through 10 says, "The wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf, the young lion, and the fattened calf will be together, and a child will lead them. The cow and the bear will graze. Their young ones will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like cattle. An infant will play beside the cobra's pit, and a toddler will put his hand into a snake's den. They will not harm or destroy each other on my entire holy mountain, for the land will be as full of the knowledge of the Lord as the sea is filled with water. On that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will look to him for guidance, and his resting place will be glorious." So this is a description of the millennial time period of peace, when not only are people on earth living at peace, but animals are living at peace with humans as well, and with each other. So, a lot of times people talk about the lion laying down with the lamb. And I love it because, like, the Bible, people say, oh, it's not a science textbook. Well, wherever it talks about science, it's accurate. So lions and lambs do not live in the same environment or biome. Wolves actually live in the same area with lambs. So when I chose pictures, I made sure I had the ones with the wolf with the lamb, because that's what's in Isaiah. And the lions, it's related to calf, because that is the prey and the predator that match, actually. So I don't know where people get the whole the lion and the lamb thing. I mean, I guess because Jesus is symbolic of both at different times in the Bible. Maybe that's where they're getting confused. But when we're talking about millennial kingdom, it's the wolf with the lamb, meaning whereas the wolf would usually prey on the lamb, he no longer does. He no longer goes after them. And a premillennialist would believe that this is actually going to happen, that animals will no longer harm each other during this time period, and that, a child could actually play with a snake and not come to any harm. All right, now I want to close out with this timeline, just to give, to me, I always like to have visuals so I can see, it just gives better impact for me. So this shows you the popularity of millennial views over time. So as you can see right here, premillennialism was held by most early church fathers. In fact, the earliest church fathers held to premillennialism, including Lactantius, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Papias, and Tertullian. We'll see that in the next slide. But those earliest church fathers, they held to that belief, starting in 30 AD when the church began, all the way up till 400. So around 400, Constantine made Christianity the state religion. And at that point, they were no longer persecuted. And what's interesting is around that time, like I had said earlier, during Origen's time, during 184 to 253, it wasn't so popular to hold the amillennialist / postmillennialist view, because of the spiritualized view, because it just wasn't popular at that time until we got to Augustine's time. Then it was accepted around 400 right here. So then you see amillennialism. It's accepted by the Catholic Church and the church in general for over like 1,000 years. And then you get to 1200, where postmillennialism is introduced, and then it's just taken up even further. This was more like Jehoiakim's time. Then we remember with Whitby and Jonathan Edwards, it becomes more popular, even so during the early 1800s, because of what was happening in America with those revivals. Postmillennium was becoming more popular, but of course, amillennium really should be stretched across here because it's still going on at that time as well. But then you see the most popular view comes again. Premillennialism comes back in vogue in the 1900s up until today. I would say that was one of the most popular views. But this is just to give you a visual of the time periods when they were popular. We'd like to think that we're not products of our time, but we are. We are influenced very much by the events going on in our world. So let's just address this more specifically. Like I said, the earliest church fathers held to premillennialism. And I had mentioned these people before: Lactantius, sorry, I struggle with his name, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Papias, and Tertullian. Those earliest church fathers held premillennialism. Origen was one of the first church fathers to promote the idea of a spiritualized millennium rather than a literal 1,000 physical reign of Jesus. His idea wasn't accepted by the mainstream church because it was considered this little fringe idea, truly because of the influence of Gnosticism on it. If you're not familiar with Gnosticism, Gnosticism is the belief, there's a lot that goes into it. This is oversimplification, but that material is bad, spiritual is good, if you wanted to sum it up. So that's a reason for spiritualizing it, saying that, the physical reign is not as necessary, it just needs to be spiritual. But I feel personally, one of the reasons I reject this out of hand, amillennialism, postmillennialism, because I feel that Gnosticism, which John was so adamant against and spent so much of his Gospels and his letters opposing, because it already crept in when he was a leader in the church. He spent so much time against it that I would not want to choose a view that was so heavily influenced by Gnosticism. By the time of Augustine, the church had accepted the allegorical interpretation, so that's another word for this, spiritualized, the allegorical interpretation, and the church as a whole embraced amillennialism. This was the popular view for over 1,000 years, and even the reformers still held to this view. Jehoiakim of Fiore, that we've discussed before, was the earliest writer who could definitively be described as postmillennialist, and there's the dates, 1135 to 1202. So postmillennialism is the last millennial view to come on the scene. Postmillennialism became popular in the 1800s because of the optimism brought on by the Great Awakening, the missionary movement, and the founding of America on biblical values, laws, and religious freedom. And finally, premillennialism has now returned to the spotlight because hopes for a man-made utopia that ushers in the second coming were dashed in the 1900s by world wars, worldwide atrocities, human rights violations as a result of the isms. So think about Nazism, communism, and terrorism. So many people have died as a result of those isms that it just doesn't even make sense to hold to a more optimistic view like postmillennialism. It led to an unraveling of the American dream and the biblical foundations due to sexual revolution, drug war, and political corruption, intensified worldwide persecution of the church. And so we see that premillennialism is a pessimistic, I would say a more realistic perspective on our current times. So we are back. I think the reason it's become more popular now, the conditions are becoming more similar to the way that they were in the early church. So up until 400, believers were persecuted for their faith by various Roman emperors. And now we're coming to a time when, due to these various isms, communism being one of the biggest ones, as far as persecuting Christians or people of any kind of faith, and terrorism as well, definitely attacking Jews and Christians. So all of these, and Nazism does that as well. So these isms really have attacked religion, attacked people with beliefs, and because of that, the persecution has risen fact, I've heard it said that there's more persecution in the last century than there has been throughout all of time combined. More people dying for their faith and having to become martyrs. So it makes sense that what was believed during the early church times when there was intense persecution, now that it's ramping up, for there to be a return to that belief. So let me stop my share. I do hope that this was helpful in understanding. I know it goes into a lot of detail and a lot of study, so thank you for hanging in there with me. And if you had not watched the specific studies on all the premillennial views of the rapture, go ahead and do that as well. So that will make sense. And until next time, goodbye.